Good morning. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leaders series, Sustainability Tools in Commercial Construction. My name is Megan Purdy and I'll be your host for today. Firstly, in keeping with our customs, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and to their cultures, and to elders, past and present. Before we get started today, I would like to acknowledge that our webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, Metechno. Metechno PIR is part of the Bondor Metechno Group, Australia's leading manufacturer of insulated wall, ceiling and roof panels. Founded in the 1950s, the group is constantly working on solutions for industrial, commercial, and residential building customers across Australia and offers the most comprehensive range of insulated panel products and systems available in Australia. Having operated in the industry for 65 years and a founding member of the Insulated Panel Council of Australasia, Bondor Metechno takes pride in being an Australian manufacturer with a full portfolio of rigorously certified products that address specific performance requirements including fire, thermal and enhanced construction productivity. Now today, we will hear from two speakers followed by our live audience Q&A, and I encourage you all to send your questions through to our speakers via the chat box. I would now like to welcome our first speaker, Laura Caccioni. Laura leads the development and maintenance of sustainability credentials for BlueScope. Her diverse career in sustainability includes roles in consulting and as a project manager for the UN Environmental Programme, where she is focused on sustainable consumption and production in emerging economies. Laura's expertise lies in lifecycle thinking, resource efficiency and decarbonisation strategies, which she uses to drive meaningful impact in her current role. She serves on the Responsible Products Expert Reference Panel of the Green Building Council of Australia and sits on the Board of Directors for the Australian Lifecycle Assessment Society. Please join me in welcoming Laura Caccioni.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Megan. I have a bit of a sore throat today, so if you hear my voice a bit hoarse, please bear with me. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today about sustainability tools in commercial construction. As you know, I work for BlueScope, so I'll be giving you a manufacturer's perspective to all of this. On the slides that I'll be showing today, I will go through just a quick agenda. So first I'll start giving you an overview of the product credential landscape and product claims. Then we'll do a little bit of a deep dive on environmental product declarations and eco-labels more specifically. And finally, I will be talking to you a little bit about how we apply these certifications or credentials in building certifications. So let's get started with product credentials and claims. So some of you may be already familiar with product credentials. So this is a bit of an overview on the landscape. You actually see that there's very different types of sustainability credentials that are applicable, especially to products in the building and construction sector. And there's ways of grouping this based on their characteristics. So first of all, just start talking about the product stewardship schemes. You may be familiar with some of these. For example, there's stewardship schemes like FSC and PFC, which are quite common for the timber industry. There's others for like ASI for the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative and Responsible Steel. One characteristic of stewardship schemes is that they tend to be industry specific and they cover a wide range of environmental and sustainability aspects, including social ones in some cases. For example, for FSC, chain of custody and having a good idea of the origin of the timber tends to be quite important. An example for responsible steel, which is it's actually relatively new, but it's a product stewardship scheme for the steel industry. It actually focuses specifically on aspects that are relevant for steel manufacturing, and it covers things from the carbon footprint and carbon intensity of the manufacturing process to aspects around, corporate governance and also social aspects and labor rights and safety and so on. So these stewardship schemes tend to be specific for a particular sector. They give you a good idea of what good looks like for that particular industry. They also cover a wide range of environmental aspects. Now, next we have eco-labels. And eco-labels are certifications that are specific to products. For example, some examples we have here. We have the Eco-Choice Aotearoa, which is an eco-label in New Zealand. And in Australia, we also have Green Tag and GECA, which is GECA stands for Good Environmental Choice Australia. The one characteristic of eco-labels is that they tend to, one, be specific to products. They will ideally set a benchmark of what good should look like for a specific product category. So they will analyze various different types of materials. So you have a specific standard for steel products or specific standard for paints, and you may have also specific criteria to timber. But the goal of an eco-label is to give you a quick idea that this product has met some rigorous benchmarks for environmental and sustainability aspects, and then they receive this tick from the eco-label. So it typically tends to be a product that is considered good in the market. Next, EPDs, and we're going to be, of course, talking a bit more about EPDs in detail. But EPDs stand for Environmental Product Declarations, and as the name say, it's just a declaration. So it's a transparency tool. It's a way for a manufacturer to actually look at the whole manufacturing process and even the whole life cycle of a product, and then transparently report information about the environmental impacts associated with the life cycle of a particular product. There's different EPD programs. So in Australia, a lot of manufacturers use EPD Australasia, which is part of the EPD international system. But there's other EPD programs in other regions. For example, we have the IBU program in Germany and SCS, which is also pretty popular in the US, for example. And finally, there's other types of declarations or claims. And we tend to categorize these as self-declarations. For example, you see a manufacturer will make a claim around a recycled content, the amount of percentage of recycled materials that are present in their products, or the recyclability of the product itself, or if the product, for example, is designed for disassembly. All of these claims are considered to be self-declarations, but there are actually some rules in place for them. And for example, there's an ISO standard that provides guidance on, how to make these self-declarations and essentially avoiding greenwashing while doing it. But from a government perspective, for example, for recycled content, so there's actually a national framework for recycled content traceability being launched by the government. So, there's more strictness that it's coming to this landscape, and, providing ways for manufacturers to make claims in a consistent manner so that the user can rely on this information and know that, if you're comparing the recycled content for one product versus another, it has been calculated in a similar fashion. So moving on, I'll be talking a bit more about EPDs, more in detail. Hopefully you have come across EPDs in your work life already, but if not, as I mentioned earlier, they're a declaration. They're a transparency tool. So EPDs aim to provide you complete and transparent information on the properties and the environmental impacts of a product based on its life cycle. One key characteristics of EPDs that are different to eco-labels, for example, is that an EPD will never make a claim or comparison with another product. So EPDs tend to be product-specific, although you can find industry-specific ones. Sometimes a group of manufacturers from the same industry get together to produce an EPD. But more commonly in the market, you will find that each manufacturer tends to do their own for their specific product. But it's just that, it's information for that specific product. It's not really making a comparison unless you decide to, pick up another EPD for a similar product and then you do their own comparison. But EPDs on their own, they do not make any claims or comparisons. They just give you that very transparent data. EPDs are getting developed as a response to market demand for environmental transparency. But they have many uses, and I'm going to be talking about this in more detail. But one of them is that they provide very useful information for a life cycle assessment. So if you're actually trying to do a life cycle assessment of a whole building, or for example, an assembly, let's say a wall, and you want to understand the environmental impact of different materials in that wall or that building or different, structure materials, let's say, you can pick up the data for an EPD and it will give you a very accurate representation of what the impacts are for that particular product that you're looking to use in your project. So it can be very useful in that way, especially for ESG engineers that are looking to assess the sustainability of projects that they're working on. So as I mentioned, EPDs are usually based on life cycle assessment. So that means that they look at the whole life cycle of a product. They're not just looking at the manufacturing process itself, but it covers everything from what we call the cradle, which is the extraction of the raw materials. And this is an example for a steel product. So it covers the extraction of materials, the transport of those materials to the manufacturing site, and also the manufacturing process. So that typically is the bare minimum that you can report on EPD, what we call the cradle to the gate. So all the resources and impacts that occur from the extraction of the raw materials to the manufacturer's gate. EPDs nowadays typically also ask you to cover a bit more. Depending on the product, you can or cannot cover the use phase, for example. If you're doing an EPD for a car, let's say, that uses fuels or a mobile phone that, requires energy to function, you might want to cover that use phase because it can be quite emissions intensive, for example. But for building materials, that's typically not the case, but you still cover the end of life. So essentially, once you've used that product, once you need to remove it from the building, then you need to transport it, you need to process it. If it can be recycled, there's typically some impacts with getting that material back to the manufacturer where it can be recycled. So that also gets captured, and that's what we call cradle to grave. So most EPDs for building products that you'll see out there are probably covering from cradle to grave. Next, another important element for EPDs is that they actually cover quite a wide range of environmental impacts. This is not an exhaustive list, but it actually gives you an idea. Most users of EPDs are interested in the carbon footprint, naturally, and that is expressed as the global warming potential, which of course leads to climate change. But there are other indicators that are also represented in an EPD. For example, you can have air pollution indicators, such as ozone depletion potential, which is linked to the creation of the ozone hole, or for the chemical ozone creation, which is linked to smog. You can have indicators for water pollution, for example, eutrophication potential, which can lead to algal blooms in waterways. And also you have indicators for non-renewable resource consumption, which are linked to the use of mineral resources or fossil fuel resources that are non-renewable. So, this just gives you an idea that information in an EPD is quite comprehensive. If you're interested in just measuring the carbon footprint of a building, then that's perfectly fine. You'll find that global warming potential number in the EPD. But if you want to have a more holistic assessment, include other indicators, that information is available there as well. And finally, just as an example, I mentioned the life cycle stages. This table on the left, it actually shows you how these are represented typically in an EPD. We cover the production stage or manufacturing stage, and that's divided in A1 to A3, which covers raw materials, the transport of those raw materials, and then the manufacturing process itself. And then we have the end of life. So I'm giving you an example of one of the EPDs that BlueScope has. And you can see on the right, also marked in red, is like end of life stage. So that includes the deconstruction, the transport of that deconstructed material, and see, if it can be disposed, it goes towards disposal. If it can be recycled, that's covered in Module D. So benefits in the next lifespan of the product. So if it gets recycled, then you can actually have a net benefit there because it will avoid, having to create this material again from scratch, which is, something that can be done with steel. So that's how it's represented, the life cycle, typically in EPDs. Another important factor, if you're ever across an EPD and you want to, read it, is actually being aware of exactly which product is this EPD covering. So typically in the results tables of an EPD, you will see the units, and that's really important. For example, in this case, we're talking about a color-bound product, and it's actually expressed in square meters. Because it's a flat product, it's a painted product, we give it in square meters. In some cases, more steel products, you'll see per ton of steel, if it's a structural steel product, for example. For timber products, sometimes it's expressed in cubic meters because that's how timber tends to be measured. So when you're comparing different materials or when you're comparing different products, you need to be sure that you're looking at similar units. And if they're not similar units, sometimes you can find conversion factors. So you're actually comparing like for like. The other very important element is that you make sure that you're comparing the application. You take into account the application, because you may actually be able to do, a very different work with, 1 ton of steel versus 1 ton of timber versus 1 ton of concrete. Not necessarily that you're gonna, the application of the material can be very different and the quantities of the material that you need. So sometimes EPDs are actually best used in the context of the whole building, where you have a whole building materials, and then you can account for, all of those factors. But next, this is where the results actually are. And, as I mentioned, they're split in all of these life cycle stages. So you'll see results for A1 to A3. This is the manufacturing stage. And, what customers tend to look mostly is for the global warming potential, which is, the carbon footprint of the product. And that's what you can see there. But as I mentioned, there's also many more other indicators that are expressed in EPDs, which you also can see here. Okay, moving on. So why are EPDs important? And, as a manufacturer, what is incentive for us to produce EPDs that can be used, in commercial buildings? First, EPDs can provide really useful information across the value chain. Sometimes if you have an intermediate product like we do, customers of ours, for example, BlueScope produces a flat steel. There's actually other manufacturers that use those materials to make products that will go directly into beam builds. One example is actually Bondor Metecno, who, we supply with some steel, and then they actually have used the data in our EPDs to produce their own. So we are giving them accurate data so that then they can produce really accurate EPDs for their own products. So that, this has an effect across the value chain. Oops, sorry. It can also help improve the Scope 3 data, and that's something we're increasingly seeing, especially from the end users. Building developers, construction companies are starting to approach us because the reporting rules for greenhouse gas emissions are starting to change and requirements are increasing. And Scope 3 emissions typically relate to all the materials and resources that a company is buying from others. And, for example, for a builder or developer that is using steel product, if the product has an EPD, then they can easily, if they know the amount of product they bought, then they can easily calculate the scope of emissions. So that's actually something that we're seeing increasing in the market. And finally, a lot of our customers also are very interested in how EPDs align with the sustainable procurement. So they're wanting to see manufacturers being transparent with the impacts of their products. And also they use these EPDs because buying products with EPDs sometimes are rewarded in green building certifications like Green Star. They're also getting important for NABERS, and that's actually relatively new, but I'll be talking about that too. But there's other schemes like the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, the ISC rating, and also LEED. So all of them have some rewards for products with EPDs. Moving on. I like to show this slide just because it really shows the increasing uptake of EPDs in the market. When BlueScope produced their first EPD, and we are actually the first ones in Australia, was back in 2015. As you can see in this graph, there were only around 2,000 EPDs. This is a global EPD numbers for the construction in the construction sector, building construction products. And now we have probably a lot more than 16,000 EPDs in the market. So there's a growing trend across the globe for demand for EPDs, and also manufacturers being more transparent and making this available. So I won't say that there is EPDs for every product. Sometimes for small manufacturers, it can be very difficult to produce an EPD. It's a lot of work involved in it, but the numbers are increasing. And I think there's a lot more awareness on potential barriers for smaller manufacturers, and hopefully those will get addressed and enable more data coming into the marketplace. Moving on, so eco-labels. So as I mentioned earlier, eco-labels are third-party certification programs that typically define a benchmark for sustainability, ensuring your product meets high standards. They will typically assess different product features. For example, product health, if there's any toxic chemicals in the EPD, in the product, the resource use associated with the manufacturer, the durability, if the product has a carbon footprint or a water footprint that is fit for purpose. And sometimes they even look at the manufacturer itself with environmental management systems and how they're doing from social aspects, social responsibility, and looking into human and labor rights. Eco-labels typically set a high benchmark. Theoretically, not every product within a product category should be able to achieve the eco-label. Otherwise, then it will be too easy. It's typically, difficult for a manufacturer to achieve it. But it can be a very simple and effective way of communicating that this product has a good environmental performance and maybe preferable against a product that doesn't have the eco-label. The eco-labels are also recognized by green building tools. For example, the Green Building Council of Australia with the Green Star rating recognizes eco-labels, and the ISC also recognizes eco-labels. And specifying these products can help earn, credits or points under these green building rating schemes. And that's kind of one of an incentive for manufacturers to start putting these eco-labels, or getting their products certified with these eco-labels and putting them on the market. Now, let's move on to the applications itself. And I've mentioned Green Star a couple of times already. For those of you who are not familiar with Green Star, it's actually Green Star rating tools were launched by the Green Building Council of Australia back in 2003. So it's been over 20 years of Green Star in Australia. It's the largest voluntary sustainability rating systems for buildings, interiors, and communities, and essentially assesses sustainability attributes of a project, typically a whole building, looking at different impact categories and credits. This graph just shows you, the increasing uptake of the Green Star rating tool. And, right now there's over 5,000 ratings already. So over 5,000 buildings in the country that have been rated with Green Star. I'm going to be talking about, how the credentials that I just went through actually can help achieving points under these green building rating tools in Green Star specifically. And Green Star Buildings is the latest tool from Green Star. It covers 8 key categories. So they actually have different criteria. Not all the criteria, of course, relate to materials or products that are used within the building, but they actually cover much more. For example, the responsible construction process, that there's a healthy building, that the people requirements, so essentially core new solutions address social health for the community. There's requirements that are associated with nature, also showing leadership, recognizing projects that are setting a strategic direction, or, they're actually being innovative in the way they're being designed and built. But, the ones that are more specifically related to materials are the responsible categories. So they want to make sure that all the buildings are being built responsibly, but also the materials that are going there have been produced in a responsible manner. And then also the positive category, so that the overall building is actually creating a positive contribution. So part of this last requirement, the positive the responsible product, the first requirement, which is being responsible, it actually is associated with a responsible products program. So this is relatively new within Green Star, but it's essentially, they have devised a whole program where different certifications, product certifications, eco-labels, EPDs, are getting assessed and then recognized by Green Star. And depending on the number of criteria and different environmental aspects and sustainability aspects that they address, they get certain points. Now, the products that have these certifications or credentials then are also recognized and awarded a certain number of points. And essentially the goal is that, the building developers and the buildings are procuring these materials that have these credentials and that have, a high responsible products value. So essentially, depending on the credentials that the product has, it gets a responsible products value. And then an overall credit can be achieved depending on how many of these products are being used and how much of the overall cost they represent. Typically, the responsible products program is relevant to the building envelope and structure, but also systems and fit outs. And depending on how many of those responsible product value points a product can achieve, it can be considered good practice or best practice. And we're just gonna go through that a little bit more. So for example, this is an example of responsible products value. So for example, if a product has an EPD, it gets a responsible product value of 5. And if they have more certifications, for example, an EPD, but also an eco-label, and then also a stewardship scheme, they can achieve up to, responsible product values 21. Everything above 15 is considered best practice. So that's kind of, you don't need to count more than 15, but if a product that you're looking to buy has more than 15, that's a really good outcome. The other credit that I mentioned was the positive. And one of those has to do with upfront carbon emissions. So essentially, the emissions that are associated with the materials, the transport, and the installation that are going into a building. And now projects are actually required to demonstrate that through the materials that they're buying for the project and the construction process and the design process, that they're actually achieving reduction. So they will compare their building with a reference design, and then they need to meet a certain reduction. So the current minimum you need to achieve is a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to that reference scenario. But from 2026, it's actually going to be 20% minimum. So the requirements are increasing over time. I guess because it's also, an urgent matter that needs to be addressed. There's a lot of carbon emissions that are associated with the building industry, and, it is important that we start addressing them now. So in this case, an EPD can really help you to do a more accurate calculation. You don't need to rely on, the value for an average product. You can actually have a really close representation for the product that you're buying. Another tool that I wanted to mention quickly was the NABERS rating tool, which is a national Australian built environment rating system. So this is actually a government-led program. And it provides a simple, reliable, and comparable sustainability rating for the built environment. It's mostly for commercial buildings, and it's managed by the New South Wales government, but it actually has a countrywide scope. Currently, the NABERS rating has been around for energy, water, waste, and the indoor environment. So those have been kind of like operational aspects of the building. But just late last year, it was the embodied carbon rating was launched. So NABERS, rates buildings from 1 to 6. All of these ratings that I mentioned are kind of standalone, but the embodied carbon one is relatively new. So what does the NABERS embodied carbon rating is going to look like? So right now it is in the pilot phase. But it covers the carbon emissions of the materials and the construction process. So it is kind of different in that way, like all previous ratings have been about the operations, but there is a need to address, as buildings become more efficient, as we decarbonize the grid, the carbon emissions that are associated with materials that are actually embedded in the building and won't be reduced over time, are becoming more important, and we need to address them. So that's the goal of this new rating tool. And the goal is that it will allow the benchmarking of similar buildings. So at this stage, they're in pilot phase. So they're trying to, gather a lot of data for a lot of different buildings so that they can develop these benchmarks. And the idea is that for new buildings, they will be assessed based on the materials and the construction process. And then depending on where you land in, kilograms of CO2 per square meter of the footprint of the building versus, the average in class, then you also get awarded a certain number of stars. So it's really going to be very interesting to see once it's in place. But yeah, stay tuned. It's still in pilot phase, but very important, a very new tool that, it really has a lot of potential. So anyway, those are a couple applications for certifications and rating tools. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for your input today. I'd now like to welcome our second speaker, Andrew Tai. Andrew is the National Sustainability Manager at Frasers Property Industrial with over 15 years of experience. He joined in 2016, overseeing the implementation of their sustainability strategy in new developments and for assets under management. Andrew comes from an engineering background, having studied photovoltaics and solar energy of engineering at UNSW and worked as a sustainability consultant prior to joining Frasers Property. He currently sits on the Green Building Council of Australia's Technical Advisory Group and the Property Council of Australia's New South Wales Sustainability Advisory Committee, providing guidance and application to integrate sustainability initiatives into the built environment. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Tai.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you today to talk through what it means for Frasers Property Industrial and our relationship with building certifications. Frasers Property Australia has been a user of building certifications for nearly over 10 years, and it's an accolade we're really proud of to continue. And I wanted to talk you through today how we approach building certifications, why we use it, and a little bit of a case study of how we apply the approaches in building certifications to help improve our sustainability performance. But first, I want to give you an overview about who we are as a business. It's important to set this context as it helps us to identify the use cases of building certifications. Frasers Property Industrial is part of a wider network of Frasers Properties globally. We're publicly listed on the Singaporean Stock Exchange, and we have businesses in over 20 countries, over 70 cities. We mainly operate in Australia, Europe, and in Southeast Asia, but the business that I am in, which is Frasers Property Industrial, we predominantly work in Australia and Europe. So this is sort of a overview of where we're broken down in different regions. And today I'll be speaking specifically around the industrial, which is the second bar from the right. We work in industrial logistics, but also importantly, we're also a sponsor to a REIT, a real estate investment trust, which is named Frasers Logistics and Commercial Trust. What this means for us is that we have a portion of portfolio which is publicly listed, independent of our parent group, which is also listed in Singapore. That also drives some of the agendas on our sustainability priorities and also opens up why we have an ambition around our sustainability objectives. Our sustainability objectives are listed here. We've kept it really quite simple. There are 6 main ones. So the first one is around achieving net zero carbon across scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2050. The second one is an ambition to install a lot of solar around the world globally. Number 3 relates to our approach to climate risk and resilience and how we incorporate that into our management and finance approaches. Number 4, which is where this topic becomes important, is having 100% of new development projects and 85% of our owned and managed assets to be green certified. Number 5 responds to our engagement with our suppliers and our approach in responsible procurement. And finally, number 6 is taking action on biodiversity. For today's session, I'll really be focusing on number 4, but the building certifications are such a wide-ranging scope of topics that all of these will be addressed in the following slides. So I wanted to start with probably the biggest question right at the beginning. What's the value of certifications? Like, why do we do it? And I've listed out 8 key aspects about why we value the use of building certifications. And predominantly, it will vary from different organizations, but these are our ones. So the first one here is trying to develop a common language of what constitutes a sustainable building. A sustainable or green building can be quite vague and mean different things to different people, but the use of a building certification tool allows that benchmarking across multiple industries, across different stakeholders, to define different levels of performance. The second is the use of the certification process to provide an independent verification of the attributes that we've included in our buildings. That independent verification not only helps us to give us a surety of what we've done, but also to prove to external stakeholders, shareholders, and the occupiers of our buildings that we've delivered on what we've promised on. Number 3 is around the ability to unlock financing from sustainably linked loans, green bonds. As we are seeing the world converge into more sustainable practices, we're seeing a huge influx of money being invested in more sustainable projects. Our alignment with green building certifications help facilitate the expectations of our lenders to what we deliver as an end product. Number 4, it aids in advancing broader sustainability objectives. And what I mean by this is a lot of the tools, which I'll go through in a bit, offer a wide-ranging spectrum of sustainability issues, from management practices to product selection to energy efficiency and even waste and biodiversity. With such a wide scope of topics, we are then allowed the introduction to things that may not be in our immediate radar and allows it to introduce the concepts to our business to take action upon something like biodiversity, which may not be something that we've tackled in the past with such a strong ambition on. Number 5, it meets customers and shareholders' objectives. Number 6, it helps us to standardize our sustainability approach, which I'll talk through in a little bit about how we operationalize the green building certification as a tool to build better. And number 7 and 8 really helps us with an ability to market the buildings that we're doing with a solid foundation to improve on what we're trying to achieve in the longer term. We don't really know where the end goal is because our targets are always moving to bigger and better ambitions. But setting a solid foundation of a consistent messaging on what a green building is through the use of certifications helps us to then improve on that. And that's how we advance our knowledge and understanding and assist the industry in moving forward on various sustainability objectives. So within Australia, there are many tools available, but we use Green Star, which is a green rating tool administered by the Green Building Council of Australia. They've got many tools out there, but for us, the ones that are of key focus relates to 2 of their suite of tools, and they're listed at the left here. So we have Green Star Buildings, which is related to the construction of new buildings. And then we also adopt and utilize another tool they have, which is called Green Star Performance, which helps us to identify and rate the ongoing performance of a facility once it's been completed. In both of these rating tools, the consistency on categories are always present. There are 8 categories of which Green Star identify as key aspects to help us address different sustainability issues. The use of the categories with also have credits within them to help gauge a level of ambition. So within these 8 categories, we range from responsible, healthy, resilient, positive, places, people, nature, and finally leadership. There are many facets and interesting ambitions listed within each of these categories. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail about all of these. Most will be surfaced out in the case study that I'll present a little bit later of how we apply the building certifications practically. But having the Green Star certification as an ambition is a great starting point, but how do we integrate it into our business process? How do we go from an ambition to an achievement? And so I want to talk you through how we approach it and integrating into our daily life on everyday projects. So our approach. I've broken down this into 2 sections. So this is prior to tendering a new development. Prior to tendering to a new development, there are mainly 4 aspects of that phase. So we have the first stage, which is project strategic definition. Then we go to concept design, tender documentation, and then design and construct. Under each of these aspects, we do have other sub-activities. So in the first aspect, right at the beginning, even before we've settled on exactly what we're going to be building, we come together and then we envision what does the objectives of this building seek to achieve around sustainability. We often engage a sustainability consultant or we advise internally with our expert staff on this topic. Once a design team has been convened, we then workshop what are the more detailed aspects of it. And this is when we will register a project for Green Star certification. And we register it at this point in time because through the concept design, we'll establish our level of ambition. During the tender documentation phase or detailed design phase, we then have multiple workshops with the design team and the Green Star consultant to workshop initiatives that we can embed, coordinate, but also challenge our consultants to do more as guided by the Green Star requirements. Once tendered, we then work closely with the contractor, and depending on the amount of D&C that's involved, our involvement can range from a weekly engagement with the construction team or a monthly or a quarterly. After that tendering process, we then go into final design development phase, which really brings the documentation to full completion or an issued for construction set. This is where everything gets locked down, everything is costed, all the value engineering aspects has been completed, and we're really locked solid on what we plan to build. At this time, it's usually the best time to undertake a design review. And a design review is more of a check with the Green Building Council on how your design that you're putting forward aligns with the Green Star requirements. We often skip this step mainly because we're really experienced at delivering Green Star and we don't necessarily need that design check. But for more complex projects or bespoke projects, this is a really great way for design teams to sense check that they're on the right track. Then the building gets built. So in the construction phase, there are a lot of documentation that is required for the contractor and the subbies and trades to pull together to achieve the Green Star rating. We need to prove a lot of things in this rating. If we've selected a particular type of steel that has certain sustainability attributes, we're required to document the proof of procurement, proof of placing, and the proof that the sustainability criteria that that material has is still valid. And then when you think about a building at a larger scale, you can imagine all of the different materials, processes that are ongoing that we require to collate. During this process, this is where we do sample assessments on what the documentation we're receiving is to ensure that when we come to the 5th stage here, which is the handover and closeout, we're in a really good position to compile all our documentation and lodge it into the Green Building Council for assessment. So after we go through this assessment process, or what the Green Building Council calls the certification process, we're afforded different types of rounds of assessment. And so I want to talk on that a little bit. So this is what the Green Star certification process looks like. So initially, the design team will produce and compile a submission in the dark blue boxes there, hand it over to the Green Building Council, and they do their first round of assessment. In that first round of assessment, there is a third-party panel convened, usually with 2 independent assessors who look at the documentation, compile their findings, and then any aspects of the documentation that's provided that requires additional clarification is then presented back to the design team. That then opens up the second round. If you're really, really great at documenting everything and you've done everything really well, you can actually skip the second round and proceed to your rating. But most often, you do get a lot of commentary back, depending on the complexity of your project. And with that, you go back and you respond to those results and comments, and then you resubmit for round 2. And after that, you should be able to get your rating. It does take a bit of time back and forth, but it's a process that we really believe in because there's a rigor behind this third-party independent assurance that we value as an organization. Green Star is also a really important tool for us to define what does good look like. And on this slide here, what I presented is Green Star's support for a net zero future around buildings. What they've outlined to us as an industry is the requirement for a net zero operating building based on years of when a building is going to be registered for a Green Star submission. So you can have a look here that, let's say, in the second row, energy use, for a building to be certified in 2026, all buildings or all registrations here must achieve a 20% reduction in energy use over a typical building. The different star ratings that you see in 2020 and 2023 indicate that for a development to achieve a 6-star rating in 2020, it must have certain attributes. In this case, in energy source, in 2020, renewable electricity and renewable energy must be provided for a building to be certified under 6-star. This is a phased approach that allows the business of the property development side to grapple with what does the next level of achievement of the best sustainable building look like. It's something that we really appreciate from the Green Building Council in terms of their runway, and it allows us to then help develop our own internal processes. There's also a big focus around materials and product transparency. So they look at the greenhouse gas emissions of a product, the circularity of products, and with that criteria set in place within Green Star, it facilitates a great discussion that then we can have with our suppliers about understanding what is in our runway on what we need to be achieving in the next 2-3 years to then signal to the market that's our desire, of which then we can then proceed with the transformation of our industry to supply the products that we require. So that's really just an overview about how we use it. And I want to give us a quick overview about how we've put this into practice on a real building that we've certified. This is a distribution warehouse out in Western Sydney, and it was certified under a 5-star design and as-built version 1.3. With this project, we took the approach of, at the concept stage, identifying what are the sustainability agenda we wanted to achieve. And we had 4 key strategies that we really wanted to excel at. We wanted to develop a highly efficient building. We really wanted to focus on materials to reduce the upfront embodied emissions. And in strategy 3, we wanted to focus on offsetting our operational energy. And number 4 is around certifying it as a carbon neutral building. So I'll step through each strategy now. So the first strategy is around a highly energy efficient building. In this regard, we installed high efficiency LED lighting, which is a no-brainer these days. We had an inclusion of a rooftop solar system of 275 kilowatts. We've also installed a battery energy storage system, which is the first that we developed in Australia for our business, supplemented with a backup generator powered by biodiesel. And to ensure that everything is running as intended, we've got extensive sub-metering to help manage the power use and to ensure that it's operating efficiently. To define what this highly efficient building looks like, we developed one of these charts to help us break down the energy consumption within the building at the early concept and design stage. We then asked the design team to identify areas where they can improve that performance, and they came back with some really great examples. We nearly achieved a neutral result in electricity, resulting in at around 6,200 kilowatt hours per year. But you can see in this waterfall chart that the primary reductions was around LED lighting because it's such an efficient use of electricity, but also the rooftop solar. So this helps us frame that we're going to the right direction. The approach here was then to enable us to move forward with what we needed to achieve. The second strategy that we really wanted to take a big stride in is around reducing our upfront embodied emissions. Here, we utilized the calculation methodology of undertaking a life cycle assessment on the materials that we included. We yielded around a 24% reduction in upfront carbon compared to a reference case, and we primarily did this through two measures. One was to reduce the concrete content by the substitution of reinforcing biomesh with steel fibers in our slab. And the second was to prioritize the use of products where we had an environmental product declaration. And the environmental product declaration allows us to use more manufacturer-specific data as it relates to the embodied carbon content. In this chart here, you can see the comparison between a reference case and the proposed case for materials construction, which is the first two bars. The second bar relates to the life cycle assessment relating to operational energy, which we achieved a significant reduction due to all of that solar and the battery storage. And the end of life was minimal, but we still made an incremental reduction. Now, strategy 3 and 4, this is where it all comes together. So once we've made the building as energy efficient as possible, and we've then selected the materials that we thought were the best to reduce the upfront embodied carbon, we then needed to shift to an operational phase for any residual electricity that we needed to use from the grid. So you can imagine the sun's not shining at night, but you still need to keep the lights on at night. That type of electricity, we shifted the electricity demand from the traditional grid power to a renewable energy source. And that enabled us to eliminate a lot of that power. And we can see this in this chart here where we did a carbon emission breakdown of the facility. With the shift to renewables, coupled with the use of the rooftop solar and the battery, we reduced the electricity consumption in that yellow bar to virtually zero. Water emissions reduced as well because we had water efficient tapware driven by the Green Star design. Waste didn't move too much, refrigerant didn't move too much, and the staff commute didn't move too much as well. But what we can see through the design decisions that we made that were guided through the Green Star and the building certification tool, we were able to see a reduction on greenhouse gas emissions of around 48% annually, which then left us with the remainder task, which is strategy 4, which is to neutralize. And when we neutralize these emissions, what we do, we purchase carbon credits or carbon offsets to then offset all of the emissions that we weren't able to tackle from a building design, from an operational perspective, and that allowed us to then help determine where we need to focus our attention for the next building. So you can see how we've unfolded the Green Star tool and building certifications and a practical example on a project here, but cascading that back up to a more group governance perspective, how we use those Green Star rating tools and building certifications to guide our business to help us define what does good look like and how do we progressively improve on that design so that we can achieve our aspirations around being a sustainable organization. And that's it from me. Thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for your insights. Well, now it's you, our audience's turn to get involved. So please ask our speakers your questions via the chat box. And don't forget to let me know who your question is directed to. A big thank you to everyone who did submit questions while registering for today. So what I might do is I'll kick off our Q&A with one of those questions. So Andrew, I'll direct the first one to yourself. The questions come through from Troy from Victoria. And his question is, what are some techniques to persuade site teams to choose sustainability options over traditional methods when the economy is not there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's always a challenge for us to really promote something new within our business. Overall, the approach that we like to take is to help to come together and collaborate. If we're choosing a sustainability option over a traditional method, there must be a payoff other than the improved benefits, and that is the shared learnings to then further perpetuate that type of technique, material, or process into other developments. So when we approach our builders to help collaborate with us on new methods, products, we also come to it through a very learning mentality. We give the space to help fail and fail fast, but in a safe way. And I'm not talking about a building collapsing or anything like that. It's more around a slight change in what they're already doing. We also need to be very clear about us as an owner, what the objectives are that we're trying to achieve overall, so that whoever comes onto our site or whoever's tendering for our jobs or who are building or supplying the materials can understand that future vision of where we want to be and allow them or invite them in to help participate and contribute to that. We're not a large team of people, so there's only so much we know that exists in the market, and we actually delegate a lot of the know-how to the experienced technicians who are delivering our construction sites. I think presenting a business case in the context of cost, but also the learnings coupled with the benefits that are aligned to the owner or the eventual people who want to see that advancement progress is a great way to balance out the cost with the sustainability objective.
Excellent. Thank you. Laura, I'll direct the next question to you. And this one's about, is reuse of materials being recognised as a strategy, sorry if I can get my words out, to drive more sustainable outcomes in commercial construction?
That's a very interesting question. I think the uptake of the reused materials, it's slowly growing. We know that there are certification schemes, for example, the Living Building Challenge, that encourages the reuse of materials. And we see, sometimes bricks are recovered for certain projects, or timber products can be repurposed, can be recovered and repurposed and used in other parts of developments. But if we're looking at larger commercial buildings, for example, the potential for reuse steel structures or steel members, that's still something that is relatively new. We see that that's already taking off in Europe, for example, and the UK has some standards to guide the recovery of structural materials, and then how to test them so that they can be reused. But it's something that is still relatively new for Australia. There are some exciting discussions that are happening in the market, and we see some interest from builders to explore the potential for reuse of structural materials. So this is definitely an area to keep an eye on. And if there is interest in exploring this, I will suggest it's important to send a demand signal to manufacturers or potential providers of these materials that can be reused.
Excellent, thank you. Now I have a question which you may both would like to comment upon, and it came through from Vanessa, if I pronounced that correctly, from Victoria. And the question was, are formal rating schemes, so Green Star, NABERS, if that's how I pronounce that one, the best way to drive or achieve sustainability outcomes? So maybe Andrew, did you want to address that question?
Yeah. Short answer is yes, it does. And the reason why it does, because of the word formal, you're held to account either through an external body or held accountable by someone within your business or a stakeholder to achieve a certain rating. Now, there are certain ratings that will grade you from, like Green Star, from a 4, 5, or 6 star, or NABERS from a 0, 1 to 6 star. And the intention isn't necessarily to be the 6 star or the best performing at the beginning. It's really to help you on your transition to be a better performing building. The challenge that a lot of entities face when they look at these rating schemes is the administrative burden of undertaking ratings, because it's something new, something different, something they've not done before. But by participating in them more often and doing them at a larger scale, you end up reaching an economies of scale and then having them just be integrated as a business as usual practice, which is kind of what happened within our business over the course of maybe 5, 6 years. So yeah, I think it is a great way to achieve it, because otherwise no one's telling you if you're doing good or bad. It's someone else got to prove that point to you.
Excellent, thank you. Laura, did you want to comment upon that one?
Sure, I agree with Andrew. These certification schemes also give you a structure. And for example, in the case of Green Star, you actually have a wide range of criteria, and you can actually choose the criteria that you see that can be addressed more easily. So you don't need to absolutely do everything that the standard requires, but you can actually also select your own priorities and decide which credits you want to target, how this aligns with, the sustainability objectives of your project as well. So it's a great way, to provide some structure and actually allow you to measure how you're doing. Otherwise, as Andrea said, it will be very difficult. In the case of NABERS, the new rating tool is more focused on embodied carbon, but that's also really important, to start actually gathering data at the building level, which there is not a lot of in the marketplace. Some consultants and engineering firms have a lot of this information, but it's not publicly available. So it's a really good way of, starting to build a database that you can benchmark yourself against, or a project against, and actually that way also can drive better outcomes over time. So developing those benchmarks will actually help you see how you're doing and how you can improve with the carbon emissions of your projects in the future.
Thank you. Laura, I'll just keep the question directed to yourself. Sketchscape Adventures are watching live, and they sent through a question saying, what kind of software is used in this process to prepare reports and how to evaluate the different materials?
That's a very interesting one. So if you are looking at it from a manufacturer perspective, there's actually LCF software that gets quite technical and quite detailed. There's software tools like Sphera, also known as Gabby, and there's another one that it's sorry, I'm forgetting the name right now. But these software tools are quite flexible. So if you actually have a manufacturing process, and all manufacturing processes can be very different, it allows you the flexibility to represent those accurately and capture that data. But if you want to do a life cycle analysis at the building level, there's actually some other types of software that are more specific to the built environment, and it can actually assist you to do an LCA for a building much more easily. One of these tools, for example, is eTool, which is actually an Australian software. There's also One-Click LCA. So that there is a range of tools out there, depending on what you want to explore and what you want to analyze. If you want to look at a building or at a material specifically, you may want to choose one software over another. Even us as a manufacturer, we have been doing lifecycle analysis and EPDs for a while. We tend to work with consultants because it's a very specialized space, and sometimes it can be time consuming. So definitely worth having a look at the software tools. But if you're stuck and this is all very new, I will encourage you to also consult with approach an LCA consultant that can guide you through this process.
Thank you. Andrew, I have a question which has come in from Araj, and I can see we've got quite a few live questions, so I'll start to bring a few more of those in. But Andrew, there was a question which came through from Araj, which was, which sustainability tools have shown the highest impact on reducing energy consumption in commercial buildings?
Yeah, I think the standout one is NABERS. So NABERS is a tool that rates your operational performance, and you need to have a NABERS rating to lease buildings now. You also require a NABERS assessor to undertake, so there's a lot of rigor behind it. So I think NABERS has been around for a long while. It was started as a New South Wales government initiative, rolled out nationally, and now it's a global sort of tool. The UK have now adopted a NABERS UK version. But the reason why it has been so successful is that it's really well at benchmarking your building to other buildings of similar size, similar activity, and similar location. Over the last 10 years, commercial office buildings, and I specify office, commercial office buildings have reduced around 30 to 40% of their energy consumption over the last 10 years by participating in NABERS. So this whole idea of measure and then manage that performance is really important, and the robustness of NABERS, as well as the ambitions of those owners who want to improve their score, has really incentivized that. But there are also other tools out there, and the biggest, I think, in Australia, one of the biggest luxuries we have is the collaboration between different bodies who own these tools. And so what you see is a lot of cross collaboration or crosswalks or recognition. So if you do a NABERS rating for your building, you can get recognized for your Green Star performance rating. You don't need to reduplicate that work to get your certification. So often it's a one approach to suit many needs, and that sort of allows the easier transition for entities who might be very familiar with NABERS because they're releasing a new commercial building, or they're trying to attract a certain tenant to transition to the other rating tools, which then focus on other things beyond energy, like water, biodiversity, material selection.
Thanks, Andrew. Laura, I've got a question which has just come through from Vishan, and just going back to the reusable material. In the unfortunate case where a sustainable or reusable material is more expensive than a more general non-renewable material, what would incentivize sustainable construction?
That's an interesting one. I would say that's a good consideration. Then you have a choice to make. If the cost of the product is really prohibitive, then it is a question about what can be done, for example, through design. It's really important to pay attention to materials and procure lower impact materials wherever you can. But there's also a lot that can be done from a design perspective. And, this may be easy to say when I'm sitting on the other side of the project and the materials, but, we've worked with consultants and we've seen some case studies where actually a lot of emissions reductions can be achieved using similar materials, but just, focusing on optimizing the design. I think another important consideration to keep in mind is durability of products, and that sometimes gets ignored. So if the products that you're, studying, maybe you have something that is cheaper upfront, but perhaps less durable, that will have higher maintenance requirements. This is something you might want to take into account. If you're looking at the whole life cycle of the project, it may be that, sometimes spending a bit more upfront will actually, help you reduce material usage and therefore the carbon emissions associated with those materials across the lifespan of the building. So, those are a couple of things that I think are worth keeping in mind, but, it's always a decision. And, it's sometimes difficult if the sustainable materials are, expensive, but there's also, I guess an incentive for sometimes investing in them, because over time that creates demand and hopefully that will help also lower costs over time.
Excellent, good answer. Thank you. Andrew, a question's come in specifically for you from Alfie, and he's asked, have you risk, if I can get my words out, any possibility that you'd lose a tender bid for a certain project because of extraordinary sustainability requirements?
So we're typically the building owner, so we're generally paying the bills of the builders or receiving the tenders ourselves. And there have been many occasions where a tender has returned back to us with a much higher cost. Our contracts administrators, our project managers are very well tuned at knowing the prices of stuff, so they can really sift through those tenders to understand what's causing it. So I wouldn't say being the highest bidder doesn't necessarily preclude you. I think it just warrants more questions to be asked from an experienced tender panel. But the way we are trying to invite our tenderers to think outside of the scope of works to find new innovative materials or alternative construction or more sustainable construction practices is to invite them to tender on a like-for-like basis on what they're required to, but then also provide a below-the-line cost on certain initiatives. So let's say, for an example, they've got a 9-month build contract. They're going to provide a cost of that construction for $20 million. But then they have a great idea because they know that we're interested in carbon emissions and reducing construction emissions. They might propose the swap out of diesel with renewable diesel. And that renewable diesel might cost an extra $200,000 for the project. The idea for that is that we're not stifling the innovations or the creative approaches that the builders or our tenderers might come to us with, but it then allows our project team to then interrogate things on a like-for-like basis, but also may selectively choose that tenderer because they have the solution to a question that we've been scratching our heads around for ages. So it might actually be worthwhile doing that, but maybe as below the line, and then follow up with a discussion and a rationale behind it.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. And Alfie says thank you too for your insights. I've got a question which came through from Manuel, and I might direct this one to you, Laura. It starts with, it would be a special type of construction, but thinking of the energy transition and need for LDS, so long duration storage, do you think that accounting for pumped storage project certifications would be valuable?
If I understand correctly, this is also associated to hydropower projects. And I believe there's specific standards that look into certifying these type of projects. I think it's definitely worthwhile. Just like for the rating schemes for buildings, I believe the standard is probably somewhat akin to what you will see on a a stewardship program that is very specific to this type of projects. It can be very useful from a perspective that, if you're looking at a hydropower project, the impacts can be, environmental, can impact biodiversity, can have, some social implications as well. And sometimes it's not really clear cut to see the benefits over the costs of implementing these type of projects. I imagine these standards will probably address all of these different considerations to a degree, and hopefully will, help you maximize the benefits of such projects while minimizing all those, negative impacts that it can have. So it's something that definitely I think should be considered. And this I'm saying, not really knowing much about the standard itself. I don't know if there's, cost associated with complying with it, but, these kind of frameworks really put things into perspective, and it can help you really assess all that, wide range of impacts. And I think that's probably valuable with as with any project.
Thanks, Laura. Andrew, I've got a question which has come in from Madiha, who's watching live. What sustainable tools and technologies, apart from certifications, can we adopt in our construction projects in Australia? Do we have a code or a standard that we should follow?
There are certain Australian standards which relate to environmental management. There's also a standard on products procurement, ISO 2400, I believe. But let's break it back down to basics and just sort of understand why we trying to do all of these sustainability initiatives. Beyond the ambition of trying to reduce our impact, a lot of the information that we need to receive to then strategize of the next step really comes down to robust data with transparency and that it's traceable and auditable. So I think under that theme, the best approaches anybody can really adopt to ensure an easy transition to a more sustainable construction practice is really good record keeping, like the processes that you have to track your bills, to track your fuels, to track the number of people coming in and out. Like we're really good at doing it for safety, but we're not necessarily so good about understanding the truck arrived to site with 15 boxes of I don't know what's a box of lights, but then we had to take but then within those boxes, like 2 of them were broken. Like those sort of knowledge and feedback will help you then hone in on how do you optimize your construction practices. So one of the ones that is really commonly used is probably the ISO 9001, and that's more of a quality assurance, putting in checks and balances to help enable the curation of your process around collecting information to enable a more sustainable practice. I do also know of technologies such as Revit, building information modeling, 4D, 5D sort of engineering to really then embed the materials on a digital model, a digital twin, to help accelerate the ability to transfer knowledge and information that may get lost from a construction to handover process. Like those things are really useful for anyone who's trying to operate a building more efficiently. So yeah, I'm sure there's other ones out there, but they're the things that come to mind right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. We are starting to get to the end. I've got one more question which has come through from Pam, and it was Laura. Can we integrate EMS energy management software like power monitoring tool into material tool, or are they two different worlds?
I wouldn't say they're two different worlds. I will consider them as probably complementary. So, if you're looking from a manufacturer perspective, I guess the emissions that come from the energy we use and the fuels we use is quite important. Tends to be a really important contributor to the emissions within the manufacturing process. So you definitely want to monitor your energy usage so that then you can actually, really understand how how impactful that can be, and how you can actually reduce your energy consumption and therefore the emissions associated with it. If you're looking at it from a building perspective, and probably Andrew might want to chime in, but it's also important to keep an eye on your operational performance, and of course, energy use in buildings is part of its life cycle. So therefore, you want to also have a look on how much energy you're using. Materials, can be complementary. So if you're talking about a building, materials kind of play a role in that initial stage during construction, and then they'll play a minor role during the operations because you need to do some maintenance and you probably need to replace some things over time. But then that operational energy becomes more important, so you probably want to keep an eye on both. I would say they're complementary, and you should probably look into both of them.
Awesome.
Can I just add in there as well from my end? Like I think it really depends on what question you're trying to answer with this information, right? Like Laura's right, like it can be used in a complementary manner, but at the end of the day, tools should only be used to help you find or collect the information to help you find the answer in a structured or repetitive way, because the challenges that we face is we're getting more and more materials, we're getting more and more buildings, we got a lot more data points. And so the issue that facing us at the moment is just a bucket load of data, where it's really hard for us to make heads or tails on. So we spend a lot of time sifting through it, sanitizing it, creating outputs or insights generated. And that could be from materials being used or energy being consumed. The integration of tools such as EMSs and the like, it really just should stem from your need to know really well what questions you're trying to answer, and they may naturally sit in two separate buckets, or they may naturally fall in the same bucket. So I think you got to step back a bit and just think about that as well.
Awesome. Look, I think we've come up to our final question, and this is where I'll pose really to both our speakers your final comment or your key takeaways from today's session. So how about Laura, are you happy to kick off with your final comments?
Yeah, sure. And, just made me think of something that has come through the questions. And it's really important to keep a holistic mindset when looking at materials. And wherever you can, evaluate them in the context of the building and what you're trying to achieve with them. Something that, of course, embodied carbon emissions are really important. We should not lose sight of them, but we also need to look at the whole life cycle of the material, how durable it is, what's going to happen with it over time, is there any potential for it at the end of life, and then how it is performing within the building. So when you're choosing materials, it's really important to evaluate them in the context of the building, and to a degree, the certification tools that we have discussed can help you do that. So yeah, I think that will be my key takeaway. Keep that whole life cycle thinking mindset when you're looking at materials and your projects overall.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Andrew?
I guess my final takeaway would be that there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of sustainability tools out there, all to answer a particular type of question that you might have. So when I walked through like our tool, which is Greenstar, and the thinking behind why we use that tool, I would encourage you to identify the why for any of your customers or clients who have sustainability ambition but not too sure how to manifest it. And the idea around proposing things because the people who are asking actually don't know all the answers. So I think it's a very collaborative, or it needs to be more collaborative to really come to an optimized solution. Don't let the budget restrict you. You're free to color outside the lines.
Excellent. Look, I love it. Great insight from the both of you. I love that color outside the lines. Look, just finally, that's all the time that we have for today. So please join me once again in thanking Laura Ciccone and Andrew Time for their time and input. I'd also like to thank Engineers Australia's industry partner, Metechno, for their support. Now, to help us to improve and plan future sessions just like today, could you please complete the short feedback form which is linked in the description box below. And finally, thank you to you, our audience, for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next Thought Leaders event. Good afternoon.